Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and A.H. Almaas, the philosopher of essence who mapped the diamond territories within human consciousness. Together and apart, they charted pathways to wholeness through different doorways, one through the symbolic imagination, the other through direct experience. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of our inner nature, one seeing archetypal patterns weaving through dreams and myths, the other discovering the immediate presence of essential qualities beneath psychological structures. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Almaas as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. The story begins, as many psychological stories do, in the twilight between worlds. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 into a Switzerland that stood at the crossroads of European thought, where the rational Enlightenment met the romantic imagination, where Protestant theology wrestled with the rising tide of scientific materialism. His father was a pastor, a man who spoke of God from the pulpit, but who seemed, to young Carl's perceptive eyes, to lack the living connection to the mysteries he preached about. His mother was something else entirely, a woman who seemed to have two personalities, one simple and domestic, the other dark and mysterious, connected to something ancient and strange. From his earliest memories, Jung lived in a world thick with the unseen. He had visions, dreams that felt more real than waking life, and a secret inner life that he dared not share with anyone. There was the dream of the underground phallus, the dream of God defecating on the Basel Cathedral, dreams that shattered the comfortable religious conventions of his childhood and introduced him to a divine that was far stranger and more complex than the Sunday school version. In the solitude of his youth, Jung discovered that the psyche was not merely personal, not simply the product of individual experience, but that it opened onto depths that seemed to have their own life, their own intelligence, their own will. He studied medicine, then psychiatry, finding himself drawn to the mysteries of mental illness, particularly the strange symbolic productions of psychotic patients whose ravings seemed to echo ancient myths and religious visions. At the Berg Holzli Hospital in Zurich, working under Eugen Bleuler, Jung developed his word association tests, discovering that certain words would trigger delays, emotional reactions, and disturbances that suggested the presence of what he called complexes, autonomous feeling-toned collections of associations that seemed to function like little personalities within the personality. Then came his fateful encounter with Sigmund Freud. For several years, from 1906 to 1913, Jung was Freud's crown prince, the heir apparent to the psychoanalytic movement. But the relationship was built on a fundamental incompatibility. Freud insisted that the libido was essentially sexual, that religion was an illusion, that the unconscious was primarily personal, shaped by repressed childhood experiences. Jung increasingly felt that this view was too narrow, that the psyche reached deeper than the personal past, that religious experience pointed to something real, even if it needed psychological understanding, and that the unconscious contained not just repressed contents, but creative, prospective elements that were trying to guide the personality toward wholeness. The break between Jung and Freud was catastrophic for both men, but for Jung it initiated what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a descent into the underworld of his own psyche that lasted from 1913 to 1919. During these years, Jung deliberately entered into a relationship with the figures and forces that arose from his own depths. He did not merely observe them or analyze them. He engaged with them, questioned them, listened to them, painted them, sculpted them, and wrote down their words. Out of this terrifying and the transformative process emerged the method he called active imagination, and the beginning of his unique understanding of the psyche's structure and purpose. Jung came to see that beneath the personal unconscious, with its repressed memories and forgotten experiences, lay the collective unconscious, a deeper stratum of the psyche that was not personal at all but universal, the psychic inheritance of all humanity. This collective unconscious contained what he called archetypes, universal patterns or predispositions to form images and to have certain kinds of experiences. The mother, the father, the child, the hero, the wise old man, the shadow, the anima and animus. These were not merely learned social roles, but deep structures of human consciousness itself, patterns that had emerged over millions of years of human evolution and that continued to shape human experience in the present. At the center of this archetypal system stood what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness, the central organizing principle of the psyche. The self was both the totality of the psyche and its center, paradoxically transcending the ego while including it. The journey toward the self, which Jung called the individuation process, became the central focus of his mature psychology. This was not simply a matter of making the unconscious conscious, as Freud had emphasized, but of establishing a living relationship between the ego and the deeper centers of the personality, of bringing into consciousness the archetypal patterns that were seeking expression, of integrating the shadow, of recognizing the contrasexual aspects of the psyche, and ultimately of allowing the self to emerge as the new center of the personality, relativizing the ego without destroying it. Jung's method was thoroughly symbolic. He saw that the unconscious speaks in images, in symbols, in myths. Dreams were not merely disguised wishes, but messages from the unconscious, communications that needed to be understood in their own symbolic language. The symbols that appeared in dreams, fantasies, and myths were not arbitrary signs, but living realities that carried meaning and energy. To work with these symbols, Jung developed his method of amplification, connecting individual symbols to their parallels in world mythology, religion, alchemy, and comparative cultural studies. A dream image of a snake might be amplified by exploring what snakes meant in various cultures: the healing serpent of Asclepius, the dangerous serpent of Eden, the Kundalini serpent of yoga, the Ouroboros of alchemy, and through these amplifications, the individual's personal relationship to the snake image would be deepened and enriched. For Jung, psychological healing was not primarily about adjusting to society or even resolving childhood traumas, though these might be necessary steps. Rather, healing was about becoming whole, about allowing the personality to develop according to its own innate pattern, about establishing a right relationship with the powers and figures of the inner world. The analyst was not an expert imposing techniques, but a fellow traveler, someone who had undertaken the journey into their own depths and could therefore serve as a guide and witness for another's journey. By the 1930s and 40s, Jung had developed a comprehensive psychology that was as much a philosophy and a spirituality as it was a clinical method. He wrote extensively on alchemy, seeing in its strange symbolic processes a parallel to the psychological transformation he observed in himself and his patients. He explored the religious and mythological traditions of humanity, finding in them the wisdom of centuries about the nature of the soul. He remained active as an analyst, teacher, and writer until his death in 1961, leaving behind a vast body of work that continues to inspire and challenge those who encounter it. But our story is not Jung's alone. Across the Atlantic Ocean and across the decades, another seeker was preparing to enter the territories of the psyche, bringing with him a different set of questions and a different set of tools. A.H. Almaas was born A. Hamid Ali in Kuwait in 1944, in the early years of oil wealth that would transform the Middle Eastern world. He grew up in a cosmopolitan Arab family, exposed from youth to the meeting of East and West, the traditional and the modern. Unlike Jung, who grew up immersed in Christian theology and European culture, Almaas was formed by Islamic culture, by the nearness of desert spaces, by a world where mysticism and poetry were woven into daily life. As a young man, Hamid Ali moved to the United States to pursue his education. He studied physics and mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley, completing his graduate work in 1973. The precision of physics, its search for fundamental principles and elegant theories, shaped his mind in ways that would later influence his psychological and spiritual work. But even as he mastered the language of science, he felt drawn to questions that physics could not answer, questions about consciousness, meaning, and the nature of the self. In the vibrant spiritual marketplace of California in the 1970s, Hamid encountered a range of teachers and teachings. He studied with Claudio Naranjo, a Chilean psychiatrist who had himself studied with Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy. Naranjo had also explored the Gurdjieff work and other spiritual traditions, and he introduced Hamid to a synthesis of psychological and spiritual approaches. Through Naranjo, Hamid encountered the Enneagram, an ancient system of understanding personality types, and he began to see how psychological patterns could be both understood and worked with in precise, almost scientific ways. But Hamid's deepest transformation came through his own inner exploration. He began to discover something that traditional psychology had not prepared him for, states of consciousness that were characterized not by thought or emotion, but by qualities of presence, by what he began to call essence. These were not peak experiences or temporary altered states, but accessible dimensions of human consciousness that seemed to have their own ontological reality. There was a quality of compassion that was not merely a feeling of compassion, but compassion itself, pure and immediate. There was a quality of strength that was not the ego's defensive strength, but strength as a beingness, a state of consciousness. There was love, joy, peace, truth, each existing not as psychological states, but as essential qualities, as aspects of what he would come to call being. Over time, Hamid, who began teaching under the name A.H. Almaas, which means diamond in Arabic, developed what he called the diamond approach, a comprehensive path of inner realization that integrated Western depth psychology with spiritual teachings from multiple traditions, particularly Sufism and Buddhism. The name itself was significant. A diamond has many facets, each catching the light differently, yet all part of one whole. Essential nature, Almaas came to see, has many qualities or facets, and the work of inner development is to discover and embody these qualities, to polish the diamond of our true nature. The diamond approach that Almaas developed was rigorous and precise. It involved inquiry, a particular kind of open-ended, present-centered exploration of one's immediate experience. Rather than analyzing or interpreting experience, inquiry meant staying with the actual sensations, feelings, and qualities that were arising in the moment, following them with curiosity and openness, allowing them to reveal themselves more fully. This was not passive observation, but an active engagement with experience that had its own intelligence and methodology. Central to Almaas's understanding was the relationship between psychological structure and essential nature. He observed that human beings develop ego structures in childhood as a way of coping with the loss of connection to essence. When a child's essential qualities are not recognized, supported, or mirrored by the environment, the child develops psychological strategies to compensate for this loss. If one's essential strength is not seen, one might develop a false strength, a defensive toughness that actually covers a sense of weakness. If one's essential value is not recognized, one might develop narcissistic strategies to extract recognition from others. These ego structures, which Almaas called the false pearl, are not merely defenses in the Freudian sense, but complete alternative ways of being that substitute for the direct experience of essence. They are complex, intelligent, and often functional in the world, but they keep us trapped in a kind of sleep, cut off from our true nature. Almaas's work involved a detailed mapping of these structures, understanding how they formed, what purposes they served, and how they could be understood and worked through. Unlike many spiritual teachers who emphasize transcendence of the ego, Almaas saw that the ego structures needed to be understood with great precision and compassion. This is where his debt to Western psychology, and particularly to depth psychology, became evident. He recognized that the defensive structures we develop are not mere obstacles to be overcome, but contain valuable information about our history, our wounds, and our specific path back to essence. To bypass these structures through spiritual practice without understanding them was to risk spiritual bypassing the use of spiritual ideas and experiences to avoid dealing with psychological material. Yet Almaas was also critical of conventional psychotherapy, which he saw as limited by its lack of recognition of essential nature. If psychology only worked with ego structures and their modifications, it could help people function better, but it could not lead to the fundamental transformation that comes from recognizing one's true nature. The goal was not to have a better, more functional ego, but to discover the dimension of being that transcends the ego self while not negating it. Almaas began teaching in the late 1970s, developing a school and community around the diamond approach. His students engaged in ongoing groups, retreats, and individual work, exploring their experience through inquiry and gradually discovering the various essential aspects and dimensions. He also began writing, producing a series of books that articulated his understanding with remarkable clarity and depth. These books, including The Void, The Pearl Beyond Price, The Point of Existence, and many others, offered both a theoretical framework and practical guidance for the journey of self-realization. Now, you might wonder, as you drift between waking and sleeping, where did Jung and Almaas actually meet? The answer is both simple and complex. They never met in person. Jung died when Almaas was only 17 years old, before Almaas had begun his own inner journey. And yet, their meeting was inevitable, because Almaas was deeply influenced by Jungian thought, incorporated Jungian concepts into his own framework, and engaged in an ongoing implicit dialogue with Jung throughout his work. Almaas encountered Jung's work through his own reading and through the intellectual atmosphere of depth psychology that permeated the California spiritual scene of the 70s and 80s. Jung's ideas about the unconscious, about archetypes, about the process of individuation, about the self, were part of the conceptual framework that Almaas both drew upon and pushed beyond. In his writings, Almaas frequently references Jung, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in gentle critique, always with respect for Jung's pioneering insights. The historical and cultural context that shaped their different approaches is crucial to understanding their relationship. Jung emerged from late 19th century European culture, a world still shaped by Christianity but increasingly secular, a world where science and religion seemed locked in an irreconcilable conflict. His project was partly to heal this split, to show that religious experience could be understood psychologically without reducing it to mere illusion, to demonstrate that the scientific study of the psyche could lead to the same territories that religion had always claimed. Almaas emerged from a very different context, the postmodern late 20th century West, particularly California, where multiple spiritual traditions had become available, where psychotherapy had become a cultural norm, where the boundaries between therapy and spirituality were increasingly fluid. He had access to Buddhist meditation techniques, Sufi practices, Gurdjieff's methods, Hindu yoga, as well as multiple schools of Western psychology. His project was to integrate these various streams into a coherent path that honored both the psychological dimension and the spiritual dimension without collapsing one into the other. There is another contextual difference worth noting. Jung's work emerged largely from his encounter with mentally ill patients, with the productions of the psychotic mind, with the dreams and fantasies of relatively disturbed individuals. Even his own confrontation with the unconscious was, by his own account, a near psychotic episode that he barely survived. His psychology was forged in the encounter with disintegration, with the threat of being overwhelmed by unconscious contents. Almaas's work, by contrast, emerged more from the relatively healthy seeker, from people who were functional enough to undertake serious inner work, but who felt a lack, a sense that ordinary life, even successful ordinary life, was missing something essential. His students were typically not psychotic, or even particularly neurotic by clinical standards. They were seekers, people drawn to spiritual development, willing to engage in the sometimes difficult work of self-inquiry. This difference in clientele shaped the different emphases of their approaches. As you let these backgrounds settle into your awareness, notice how two different streams begin to flow toward each other. One stream begins in the depths of the European psyche, in the confrontation with madness and meaning, in the world of symbols and myths. The other begins in the precision of physics and the immediacy of meditative awareness in the meeting of Eastern wisdom and Western psychology. Both streams are flowing toward the same sea, the sea of human wholeness. But they take different courses, carve different channels through the landscape of consciousness. Let us wade now into the deeper waters, into the place where their ideas meet and mingle, where we can see both the common destination and the different paths. The conversation between Jung and Almaas begins, as it must, with the question of the self. For Jung, the self was the central concept of his mature psychology, perhaps his most important discovery, and certainly his most mysterious. The self, as Jung understood it, is not the ego, not the conscious I that we identify with in daily life. Rather, the self is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, and simultaneously the center of that totality. Jung often used the symbol of the mandala, the circular form with a center, to represent the self. He noticed that his patients, when undergoing deep psychological transformation, would spontaneously draw or dream mandalas, as if the psyche itself were trying to represent its own center and wholeness. The self, in Jung's view, is an archetype, the archetype of wholeness and totality. It is a priori organizing principle of the psyche, the pattern according to which the personality develops and seeks to realize itself, the process of individuation. The central goal of Jungian analysis is the process by which the ego comes into relationship with the self, recognizing that it is not the center of the personality, but a kind of representative or agent of the deeper center. Jung was careful to distinguish the self from the ego. The ego is the center of consciousness, the I that thinks and wills and makes decisions. It is necessary and important, but it is only a part of the total psyche. When the ego inflates itself, thinking it is the whole, we have egomania, grandiosity, inflation. When the ego is too weak, crushed by unconscious forces, we have disintegration, psychosis. The healthy ego is strong enough to stand on its own, but flexible enough to recognize and relate to the self. The self has a numinous quality, Jung observed. Encounters with the self often feel religious or spiritual, carrying an intense sense of meaning, of otherness, of something greater than the personal. In dreams and active imagination, the self might appear as a divine figure, as a wise guide, as a king or queen, as a radiant child, or as geometric forms like the mandala or the quaternity. Jung noted that traditional religions, in their symbols of God, were actually representing the self, the divine image within the human psyche. This was not, for Jung, to reduce God to psychology, but to recognize that our experience of the divine comes through the psyche and can therefore be studied psychologically. The relationship between ego and self is one of the central dynamics of Jungian psychology. In the first half of life, the ego needs to develop, to become strong, to establish itself in the world. But at midlife, often triggered by a crisis, the psyche begins a reorientation. The goals and values of the ego, which once seemed so important, begin to feel hollow. New energies arise from the unconscious, demanding attention. Dreams become more insistent. The personality begins the turn toward the self, toward wholeness. This process is not smooth or comfortable. It involves encountering one's shadow, the parts of oneself that have been rejected or denied. It involves recognizing the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche. It involves the dissolution of cherished identifications and the emergence of new patterns. Jung saw this process as natural, as the psyche's own teleology, its inherent purposiveness. The psyche is not just mechanically determined by the past, as Freud suggested. It is also pulled forward by the future, by the unrealized potentials, seeking to become actual. Almaas, when he writes about the self, both acknowledges Jung's insights and points to what he sees as their limitations. In his book The Pearl Beyond Price, Almaas explores what he calls the personal essence, an essential aspect that bears striking similarities to Jung's self. The personal essence is the sense of being a real individual, but not the false, ego-based sense of being a separate entity. Rather, it is essence manifesting as personhood, the experience of I am in a way that is both personal and transpersonal. Like Jung's self, Almaas's personal essence integrates the personal and the universal. It is your own unique manifestation of being, yet it is made of the same substance as all being. It has a quality of autonomy, of being centered in oneself, yet it is not defensive or separate in the way the ego is. When the personal essence is present, there is a sense of authenticity, of being fully oneself without effort or contrivance. But here is where Almaas begins to depart from Jung. For Jung, the self is primarily an archetypal image, a symbol, a representation. We approach the self through its symbolic manifestations in dreams, fantasies, and myths. We never experience the self directly, Jung suggested, but only its effects, its images, its numinous presence as it appears to the ego. For Almaas, essence in general and the personal essence in particular are not symbolic, but are direct, immediate experiences. When you touch essence, you are not experiencing a symbol of something else. You are experiencing a quality of being itself. Compassion essence is not a symbol of compassion or a representation of compassion. It is compassion as a state of consciousness, as a way of being. This is a subtle but profound difference. Almaas argues that Jung, for all his brilliance, remained within the realm of the symbolic imagination. He never quite made the leap to recognizing that what the symbols point to can actually be experienced directly. The mandala that represents wholeness is powerful and useful, but it is still a representation. The experience of wholeness itself, as a quality of being, is available beyond the symbolic level. This difference in approach reflects a different epistemology, a different theory of how we know what we know. Jung's method is hermeneutic, interpretive, symbolic. We work with the images that arise from the unconscious. We amplify them. We relate to them. And through this symbolic work, transformation happens. We don't need to experience the self directly. Relating to its symbolic manifestations is sufficient, and indeed may be safer than direct confrontation with such a powerful archetype. Almaas's method is more phenomenological and experiential. The practice of inquiry involves staying with the direct, immediate experience of what is happening in consciousness. What do you notice right now? What are the actual sensations, feelings, qualities present in this moment? As you stay with these experiences without interpreting or analyzing them prematurely, they reveal themselves more fully. A sensation of tightness in the chest might, if followed with open inquiry, reveal itself to be a contraction against sadness, and the sadness itself might open into a sense of grief, and the grief might reveal beneath it a quality of tenderness or love. This is not symbolic interpretation. You are not saying the tightness means or represents something. Rather, you are following the actual experiential unfolding, allowing experience to reveal its deeper dimensions. When essence is contacted in this way, it is unmistakable. It has a substantiality, a reality that is different from ordinary psychological states. It is experienced as more real, not less real, than ordinary consciousness. In this sense, Almaas is working more in the tradition of phenomenology and direct contemplative practice than in the tradition of symbolic interpretation. His background in Buddhist meditation is relevant here. In Buddhist vipassana, or insight meditation, the instruction is to observe experience as it is, without adding concepts or interpretations. Notice the arising and passing of sensations, feelings, thoughts. This training in bare attention, in direct observation of experience, is foundational to Almaas's approach. But Almaas does not dismiss Jung's work with symbols. Rather, he sees it as a necessary stage, a way of working, with the psyche that is appropriate for certain levels of development. When we are identified with the ego structure, we cannot experience essence directly because the structure blocks that experience. The symbols that arise in dreams and active imagination are communications from the deeper dimensions of the psyche, and working with them can begin to loosen the ego's identifications. In Almaas's framework, Jung's method is psychological work, which is necessary preparation for essential work. Psychological work involves understanding the ego structures, seeing how they formed, recognizing the childhood wounds and defenses, bringing unconscious material into consciousness. This is valuable and important, but it is not the end of the journey. Beyond the psychological level lies the essential level, where we can actually experience the qualities of being that the psychological structures have been covering. Here we come to another key difference between the two approaches. For Jung, the unconscious is the primary source of wisdom and guidance. The ego needs to listen to the unconscious, to attend to its messages in dreams and fantasies. The unconscious contains not only personal, repressed material, but the collective wisdom of the archetypes. To disconnect from the unconscious is to cut oneself off from the sources of meaning and vitality. For Almaas, the situation is more complex. There is unconscious material, certainly, and it needs to be made conscious. But the deepest truth is not in the unconscious. It is in presence, in immediate aware beingness. The unconscious, in Almaas's view, is where we have stored experiences, patterns, and contents that we could not fully process or integrate. Making the unconscious conscious is important, but it is in service of a deeper goal, being present to what is, here and now. In fact, Almaas suggests that both the conscious and the unconscious are structures, ways that the ego mind organizes and filters experience. Beyond both lies what he calls true nature or being, which is not structured in the same way. Being is not unconscious. It is superconscious or transconscious. It is not hidden. It is simply not recognized because we are caught in the mental structures that filter it out. Imagine, if you will, as you sink deeper towards sleep, a clear sky. Jung asks us to pay attention to the clouds, to the shapes they form, to the patterns and images that appear in them. These clouds are the contents of the unconscious, and by studying them carefully, we can learn about the deeper patterns that shape our experience. Almaas asks us to recognize the sky itself, the clear space in which clouds appear. The sky is not another cloud, not another content of consciousness, but the spaciousness, the openness, the awareness itself that holds all contents. This is not to say that Almaas ignores the contents. His work involves very detailed attention to the specific qualities and patterns of ego structure, probably more detailed in some ways than Jung's work. But the frame is different. The contents are seen as obscurations of essence, as patterns that need to be understood and worked through in order to reveal the essential nature that is always already present. Another crucial area of comparison is the relationship between the personal and the transpersonal, between individual psychology and spiritual realization. Jung, especially in his later work, was deeply interested in the transpersonal dimension. His studies of alchemy, of Eastern religions, of Gnostic texts, all pointed toward his recognition that the psyche opens onto dimensions that transcend the personal. The collective unconscious itself is transpersonal. It is not personal property, but the common inheritance of humanity. Yet Jung remained cautious about claims to transcend the psyche. He was critical of what he saw as inflation in spiritual seekers who identified with archetypal energies or claimed to have transcended the ego entirely. He saw many spiritual experiences as psychological phenomena that needed to be understood in psychological terms. The vision of Christ or Buddha that appears in a dream is not necessarily a message from the historical Christ or Buddha, but may be the self appearing in this particular symbolic form. This is where Jung's commitment to psychology as a discipline shows itself. He wanted to be scientific, or at least empirical, studying the phenomena that appear in consciousness without making metaphysical claims about their ultimate source. Whether there is a reality beyond the psyche, whether God exists outside of human experience, these questions were, Jung insisted, beyond the scope of psychology. Psychology can study the images and experiences of God as they appear in the human psyche. It cannot prove or disprove God's existence. Almaas takes a different stance. While he respects the psychological dimension and insists on working through psychological material, he is clear that there is a dimension of being that is not reducible to psychology. Essence is not a psychological state, not a complex, not an archetype. It is ontological, a dimension of reality itself. When you experience essential strength, you are not experiencing a representation or a symbol of strength. You are experiencing strength as a quality of being, as what you are made of in that moment. This claim is more metaphysically bold than anything Jung allowed himself. Almaas is saying that there is a dimension of reality, which he calls true nature or being, that is directly knowable through human consciousness. This is not a matter of belief or faith, nor is it a matter of symbolic interpretation. It is experiential, verifiable, through one's own direct experience. In this sense, Almaas stands more in the tradition of the perennial philosophy, the view that there is a fundamental reality that mystics and sages across cultures have discovered, and that it can be known through disciplined inner exploration. Jung was ambivalent about the perennial philosophy. He recognized the similarities across mystical traditions, which he often explained as arising from the universal structures of the collective unconscious. But he was skeptical of claims that there is one universal truth that all traditions point to. He saw the irreducible differences between traditions as important, not just surface variations on a common core. Almaas's approach attempts to bridge this divide. He acknowledges the specific forms and practices of different traditions, but he also maps what he sees as the common terrain of essential realization. The qualities of essence, love, peace, strength, will, compassion, and so on appear across traditions, though they may be named differently. His own work draws explicitly on Sufism, with its understanding of the divine qualities or attributes, and on Buddhism, with its understanding of emptiness and Buddha nature, as well as on Hinduism, with its understanding of Atman and Brahman. Yet, Almaas is not simply importing Eastern concepts into Western psychology. He is attempting to create a genuinely integrative approach that respects both the psychological insights of the West and the spiritual insights of the East. This means taking seriously the ego structures that Western psychology has mapped so carefully, not bypassing them in favor of some pure spiritual state, but also not stopping at the psychological level, recognizing that human beings have the capacity to realize dimensions of being that transcend the personal ego. Consider now the different attitudes toward suffering and healing. For Jung, neurosis, psychological suffering, contains within it the seeds of its own cure. The symptom is not just a problem to be eliminated, but a message from the unconscious, pointing towards something that needs to be integrated. The depression that will not lift might be the psyche's way of forcing a descent into the depths, a necessary withdrawal of energy from the outer world in order to attend to inner transformation. The anxiety that persists might be alerting us to an unlived life, to potentials that are trying to be born. Jung's approach is therefore to listen to the symptom, to explore it, to ask what it wants, what it is trying to say. This is very different from the medical model, which sees symptoms as diseases to be eliminated. In Jungian analysis, the goal is not simply to remove symptoms, but to understand them as part of a larger process of individuation. Sometimes symptoms do resolve through this understanding, but sometimes they transform into something else, or sometimes they remain as a kind of chronic reminder of the psyche's deeper currents. Almaas has a somewhat different view of psychological suffering. In his understanding, suffering arises primarily from the loss of contact with essence and from the false solutions, the ego structures that we develop to compensate for that loss. The structures themselves, while functional in many ways, inherently involve suffering because they require constant effort to maintain and because they never quite satisfy the deep longing for essence that drives them. For example, if we developed a narcissistic structure in response to not having our essential value recognized in childhood, we may spend our life seeking admiration and recognition from others. This may even work to some extent. We may achieve success and receive praise, but it never quite fills the hole inside, because what we are really longing for is not the admiration of others, but the direct experience of our own essential value, which does not depend on others' responses. In this view, the resolution of psychological suffering comes not primarily from understanding the symptom or integrating the unconscious content, but from recognizing and dissolving the ego structure that is creating the suffering and allowing essence to emerge. This is not a quick or easy process. The ego structures are deeply entrenched, supported by a lifetime of beliefs and conditioning. They protect us from experiences that once felt unbearable. To dissolve them requires patience, courage, and support. Almaas's method of inquiry is designed for this purpose. As you inquire into your immediate experience, staying with what is actually happening in this moment, the structure begins to reveal itself. You notice the tension, the effort, the holding. You notice the thoughts and beliefs that support the structure. I need to be perfect to be loved. I can't let anyone see my weakness. I have to control everything to be safe. As these beliefs become conscious and are held in awareness with curiosity rather than judgment, their grip loosens. And as the structure loosens, essence begins to emerge. This is experienced as a shift in the quality of consciousness. Instead of the effortful, contracted state of the ego structure, there is a sense of spaciousness, of ease, of qualities like joy or peace or strength arising not from doing but from being. This emergence of essence is often accompanied by physical sensations, a warmth in the heart, a sense of grounding in the belly, an opening in the chest, as well as emotional releases, insights, and a palpable sense of coming home to oneself. So while Jung might work with the symptom through exploring its symbolic meaning and its place in the individuation process, Almaas works with it by inquiring into the immediate experience of the symptom, following it to the structure beneath it, understanding the structure, and allowing essence to emerge as the structure is seen through and released. Both approaches honor the symptom's intelligence. Both see it as meaningful rather than just pathological, but they work with it differently. Let us turn now to the question of practice, of method, of how the actual work of transformation happens. Jung's primary methods were dream work and active imagination. Dreams, as we have noted, were for Jung the royal road to the unconscious, not in Freud's sense of disguised wishes, but as genuine messages and communications from the psyche's depths. Jung taught his patients to record their dreams, to sit with them, to explore their images without rushing to interpretation. The Jungian approach to dreams is not to decode them according to a fixed symbolic dictionary, but to let them speak in their own language. What feelings does the dream evoke? What associations does the dreamer have to the various images? How does the dream story reflect or comment on the dreamer's current life situation? And what archetypal themes might be present, connecting the personal dream to universal patterns? Sometimes Jung would amplify a dream image by bringing in parallel symbols from mythology, religion, or alchemy. A patient dreams of descending into a cave. Jung might explore underworld journeys in various myths, the descent of Persephone, the hero's journey to the land of the dead, the alchemical nigredo or blackening. The purpose of this amplification is not to reduce the personal to the universal, but to enrich the personal with the universal, to help the dreamer see that they are participating in an archetypal pattern that has been experienced by countless humans across history. Active imagination was Jung's other primary method. This involves entering into a conscious dialogue with figures from the unconscious. Unlike free association, where one thought leads randomly to another, active imagination is more structured. You begin with an image, perhaps a figure from a dream or a mood or a fantasy, and then you actively engage with it, allowing it to develop into a full scene or encounter while maintaining your conscious awareness. Jung gave the example of a patient who was troubled by a dark, threatening figure in her dreams. Rather than simply analyzing this figure, Jung had her enter into active imagination with it. She imagined the figure before her and asked it questions. Who are you? What do you want? As she maintained this dialogue, staying present and conscious while also allowing the imaginal process to unfold, the figure transformed, revealed layers of meaning, and eventually became less threatening and more integrated. Active imagination requires a particular balance. You must be engaged enough to allow the process to unfold, to give the figures and images autonomy, to not control or manipulate them with the ego's agenda. But you must also remain conscious enough to witness and participate, to not be overwhelmed or possessed by the unconscious material. It is a tightrope walk between consciousness and unconsciousness, a deliberate meeting place between ego and self. Almaas's primary method is inquiry, which has some similarities to active imagination, but also significant differences. Inquiry in the diamond approach is a present-centered exploration of immediate experience. It often begins with a simple question. What are you experiencing right now? And then, can you stay with that and see where it goes? For example, you might notice that you feel anxious. Rather than analyzing the anxiety or trying to make it go away, you inquire into it. Where do you feel it in your body? What is its quality? As you stay with the sensations, you might notice that there is a tightness in your chest and a busy quality in your mind. You stay with those. What is the tightness like? What is the busy mind trying to do? As you continue to follow the thread of your experience with open curiosity, something begins to shift. Perhaps you realize that the busy mind is trying to figure something out to solve a problem. You notice the sense of effort in this. You feel how exhausting it is. And then you might notice a belief beneath the effort. If I don't figure this out, something bad will happen. Now you are getting closer to the structure. This belief and the passant, anxiety and effort that go with it, form a pattern. As you recognize this pattern, as you see it clearly as a pattern rather than as truth, something loosens. You might suddenly realize that you don't know what will happen, that the future is actually unknown, and in that not knowing, there might be a moment of spaciousness, of rest. This spaciousness, if you stay with it, might reveal itself as a quality of essence. Perhaps you experience a sense of peace, not as the absence of anxiety, but as a positive quality, a state of consciousness that has its own substantiality. Or perhaps you experience trust, a sense that it is okay to not know, that you can be with whatever happens. This trust is not a mental decision. It is a quality of being that you are experiencing directly. The inquiry process is iterative and deepening. You do not inquire once and resolve everything. Rather, you continue to inquire, session after session, year after year, each time going deeper into the structures, each time discovering more subtle layers, each time accessing more refined aspects of essence. Almaas has mapped many specific ego structures and their corresponding essential qualities, providing a kind of terrain map for the journey, though each individual's journey is unique. One significant difference between Jung's and Almaas's methods is the role of the body. While Jung certainly recognized the importance of the body and was interested in how psychological states manifest physically, his work was primarily focused on the imaginal realm, on images, symbols, and fantasies. The body was important, but somewhat in the background. For Almaas, the body is absolutely central. Essence is experienced in the body. The qualities of being manifest as specific bodily sensations. Essential strength is felt as a sense of solidity and groundedness in the body, often centered in the belly or legs. Essential love is felt as a warmth and melting quality in the chest. The inquiry process always includes attention to bodily sensations, as the body is where we can track most directly the shifts between structure and essence. This emphasis on the body connects Almaas's work to somatic psychotherapy and to body-based spiritual practices. In Sufism, there is attention to the subtle centers or latif in the body where different qualities are experienced. In Taoism and yoga, there are systems of energy centers and channels. Almaas draws on these traditions, but also develops his own precise phenomenology of how essence manifests in the body. Another methodological difference concerns the relationship between practitioner and student or therapist and patient. Jung understood the therapeutic relationship as a dialectical process, an encounter between two psyches. He spoke of the analyst's need to undergo analysis themselves, not just once, but repeatedly, because the analyst's own unconscious would inevitably be constellated by the work with patients. The analyst could not stand. outside as a neutral observer, but was inevitably drawn into the psychological field of the work. Jung also recognized the phenomenon of transference and countertransference, though he understood them somewhat differently than Freud. For Freud, transference, the patient's projection of feelings about parental figures onto the analyst, was primarily an obstacle that needed to be analyzed and dissolved. For Jung, transference was a necessary phase of analysis, a way that the unconscious material became available to be worked with. The patient's falling in love with the analyst, or becoming angry with the analyst, or idealizing the analyst. All these were expressions of archetypal patterns seeking conscious integration. Almaas also recognizes transference and works with it, but his ultimate goal is somewhat different. In the diamond approach, the teacher is not primarily a symbolic figure onto whom the student projects, but a real person who embodies certain essential qualities and who can recognize those qualities in the student. The relationship is not just a therapeutic container, but a transmission, a way that the student can learn to recognize essence in themselves through seeing it in the teacher and experiencing the teacher's recognition of them. This is more like the traditional spiritual teacher-student relationship than the therapeutic relationship. The teacher has traveled the path, has done the work of realizing their own essential nature, and can therefore guide and recognize the student's process. There is a respect, even a devotion, in this relationship that goes beyond the professional boundaries of conventional therapy. At the same time, Almaas insists that the relationship must not become idealized or bypassing. The student's psychological patterns will absolutely appear in the relationship with the teacher, and these need to be understood and worked through, not glossed over with spiritual ideas. If the student has a pattern of seeking the perfect parent, they will bring this pattern to the teacher, and it needs to be recognized as a pattern, not acted out or indulged. As you let these methodological differences settle into your awareness, you might notice a broader pattern emerging. Jung's approach is more romantic, more imaginal, more willing to dwell in ambiguity and mystery. He trusts the symbolic process, trusts that meaning will emerge from engaging with the images that the unconscious presents. He is content to not know the ultimate answers, to live with paradox, to accept that the psyche has depths that can never be fully plumbed. Almaas's approach is more precise, more phenomenological, more oriented toward direct realization. He maps the terrain carefully, identifies specific structures and qualities, provides detailed instructions for the journey. He is influenced by the scientific method, by the desire for clarity and verification. Yet he is also deeply mystical, committed to the direct experience of being, unwilling to settle for symbols when the reality itself can be known. These differences in temperament and method reflect different gifts. Jung's gift was his profound engagement with the symbolic imagination, his ability to see the archetypal patterns weaving through human experience, his respect for the mystery and otherness of the unconscious. Almaas's gift is his precise phenomenology of inner experience, his integration of psychological and spiritual understanding, his practical methods for realizing essential nature. Let us explore now one of the most fascinating points of contact and divergence between these two, their understanding of what Almaas calls the whole, and Jung might call the shadow or the wound. Both recognize that human beings carry deficiencies, lacks, painful absences that profoundly shape their psychology, but they understand these quite differently. For Jung, the shadow is the part of ourselves that we have rejected, repressed, or denied. It contains qualities that the ego finds unacceptable: our anger, our sexuality, our envy, our weakness, as well as positive qualities that we have not claimed. The shadow is cast by the light of consciousness. Whatever the ego identifies with as me automatically creates a shadow of not me. The task is to recognize the shadow, to withdraw our projections of it onto others, to acknowledge these rejected parts as aspects of ourselves. The integration of the shadow is a crucial step in individuation. We cannot become whole while disowning parts of ourselves, but shadow integration is difficult and often painful. It means facing things about ourselves that we have spent a lifetime avoiding. It means recognizing that the evil we see in others exists also in ourselves. Yet Jung saw this work as absolutely necessary, both for individual wholeness and for collective sanity. The unrecognized shadow gets projected onto others, leading to scapegoating, prejudice, and ultimately to collective quote, evils like genocide. Almaas has a related but distinct concept that he calls the whole. In his understanding, when we lose contact with an essential quality in childhood, we experience this loss as a deficiency, an absence, a hole in our being. If our essential strength was not supported, we feel a hole where strength should be. If our essential value was not recognized, we feel fundamentally deficient in value. These holes are extremely painful, often unbearable to the young psyche. To deal with these holes, we develop what Almaas calls the false pearl, an ego structure that attempts to fill or cover the hole. If we feel a hole of deficiency in value, we might develop a grandiose structure that constantly seeks admiration to prove our worth. If we feel a hole of weakness, we might develop a defended, tough persona that can never show vulnerability. The ego structure is the false solution to the real problem of the lost essence. The crucial insight is that the whole is not just a lack or an absence. It is the specific absence of a particular essential quality. The whole contains, in negative form, a map to essence. To work with the whole, we cannot simply fill it with ego activity, which is what the structure tries to do. Instead, we must be willing to experience the whole, to feel the deficiency directly, without trying to fix it or escape from it. This requires tremendous courage, because the holes are associated with our deepest fears and pains. The hole of deficiency in value carries the feeling of worthlessness, of being a nobody, of having no right to exist. To stay present with this feeling, rather than running to our compensatory structures, is extremely difficult. Yet Almaas teaches that when we can stay with the whole, when we can allow ourselves to fully experience the deficiency without resistance, something remarkable happens. The whole transforms, it opens, and through the opening, the essential quality that was lost begins to flow back. This is not a matter of believing or visualizing or trying to create the essential quality. It is a spontaneous emergence that happens when the ego structure gets out of the way and the whole is allowed to be. The feeling of worthlessness, if fully allowed and not resisted, might suddenly open into the recognition of essential value, the direct experience that you have value simply by being, not because of anything you do or achieve, but because your nature is valuable. This is profound psychological and spiritual alchemy. The very wound, fully faced, becomes the doorway to healing. The deficiency, fully experienced, reveals itself to be the absence of essence, and the recognition of that absence allows essence to return. In Almaas's phrase, the shell of the nut contains the shape of the nut. The structure of the wound contains the structure of the essence it is defending against. Jung would likely resonate with this understanding though he would articulate it differently. He recognized that our wounds and symptoms often point toward our unlived potential, toward aspects of ourselves seeking to be born. The neurosis is not just a problem but a potential. The breakdown is also a breakthrough. The dark night of the soul is the preparation for a new day. Yet, there is a difference in emphasis. Jung was more focused on the integration of opposites, on bringing together conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, masculine and feminine, in a new synthesis. Almaas is more focused on the vertical dimension, on the movement from structure to essence, from ego-based consciousness to being-based consciousness. For Jung, the goal is wholeness, the self as the integration of all the parts. For Almaas, the goal is realization of true nature, the recognition of what you fundamentally are beyond all structures. These are not necessarily contradictory, but they are different emphases, different orientations. One could say that Jung is more concerned with horizontal integration, bringing together all the aspects of the personality into a whole, while Almaas is more concerned with vertical realization, discovering the dimension of being that transcends the personality while including it. Consider their different relationships to what might be called the transcendent function. For Jung, the transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to create new symbols that unite opposites and carry the personality forward in its development. When the ego is stuck between two incompatible options, neither of which seems right, the unconscious may produce a dream or a fantasy that presents a third option, a symbolic solution that transcends the opposition. The transcendent function is not transcendent in the sense of otherworldly or spiritual. It is transcendent in the sense of going beyond, of creating a new level of organization that includes and transforms the previous level. It is the psyche's creative intelligence, its capacity for growth and transformation. Jung saw this function as operating throughout life, producing the dreams and symbols that guide individuation. Almaas would recognize something similar in what he calls the optimizing force, or the dynamism of being. In his understanding, being itself is intelligent, dynamic, alive. It has an inherent direction toward realization, toward the manifestation of its own potentials. When we get out of the way, when the ego structures relax their grip, this optimizing force naturally moves the process forward. The inquiry process is partly about learning to cooperate with this optimizing force rather than fighting against it. When you inquire into your experience, you are not trying to make something happen. You are allowing what is already trying to happen to unfold more fully. You are removing the obstacles, the contractions, the defensive maneuvers that block the natural flow of realization. Both Jung and Almaas, then, trust in an intelligence that is deeper than the ego's intelligence. Both see the ego's attempts to control and direct as often working against the deeper process. Both counsel a kind of surrender, a willingness to not know, to allow the process to unfold according to its own wisdom. Yet Jung's trust is in the symbolic process, in the emergence of meaningful images and figures from the unconscious, while Almaas's trust is in the direct experience of being, in the immediate qualities that reveal themselves when the structures relax. Let us explore now their different understandings of spirituality and religion. This is a vast territory, but we can mark some of the major landmarks. Jung, as we have noted, came from a Protestant Christian background but had a deeply ambivalent relationship with Christianity. On one hand, he saw profound psychological truths in Christian symbolism, the incarnation, the crucifixion and resurrection, the Trinity, the figure of Christ as self-symbol. On the other hand, he saw the Christian church as having lost the living connection to these symbols, reducing them to dogmas and moral prescriptions. Jung was fascinated by other religious traditions precisely because they had maintained practices and teachings about psychological transformation. He studied Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, particularly as these were being translated and introduced to the West in the early 20th century. He wrote introductions to translations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the I Ching. He saw in Eastern religions sophisticated psychologies of consciousness that the West had largely lost. Yet Jung also warned against Westerners simply adopting Eastern practices wholesale. He felt that these practices emerged from different cultural and psychological contexts and might not work the same way for Western practitioners. He saw some of his patients who had taken up yoga or Zen as bypassing their own psychological material, using Eastern practices as an escape from, rather than an engagement with their shadow and their wounds. Jung's own approach was to mine the Western tradition for its esoteric and symbolic resources. His study of alchemy was precisely this discovering in medieval and Renaissance alchemical texts a symbolic language for psychological transformation that was native to Western culture. The alchemists, in their quest to transform base metals into gold, were, Jung argued, really describing the transformation of the psyche, the refinement of consciousness, the realization of the self. Similarly, Jung found in Gnosticism, in Christian mysticism, in the Kabbalah, Western traditions that spoke to the mysteries of the psyche. These were not Eastern imports, but part of the West's own heritage, suppressed by Orthodox Christianity but never entirely lost. By recovering these symbolic traditions, Jung hoped to provide Westerners with a path to psychological and spiritual development that was rooted in their own cultural soil. Almaas comes from a different position. Growing up in the Middle East, he was formed by Islamic culture, particularly its mystical strain, Sufism. Sufism has a rich understanding of the qualities of the divine, of the stations and states of the mystical path, of the relationship between ego self and true self. In Sufi thought, God has 99 names or qualities: the compassionate, the just, the powerful, the generous, and the mystical path involves realizing these qualities within oneself, understanding that the divine qualities are not separate from human nature but are the deepest truth of human nature. This Sufi understanding clearly influenced Almaas's concept of essence and its qualities. When he speaks of essential compassion or essential strength, he is echoing the Sufi understanding of divine qualities. But Almaas has taken these concepts out of their specifically Islamic theological context and articulated them in a more universal, experiential framework. Almaas also studied and practiced Buddhism, particularly the Tibetan Buddhist tradition with its sophisticated phenomenology of consciousness and its practices of meditation and inquiry. Buddhist concepts like emptiness, Buddha nature, and the various levels of self and no-self deeply influenced his work. But again, he did not simply adopt Buddhist teachings. He integrated them into his own synthetic framework. The result is that Almaas's work is genuinely trans-traditional. It does not belong to any one religious tradition, but draws on multiple traditions while creating something new. This reflects the spiritual situation of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, where multiple traditions are available and where many seekers create their own paths by integrating elements from various sources. Jung might have been somewhat cautious about this approach, worried about the loss of rootedness that comes from leaving one's own tradition entirely. but he also would likely have appreciated the genuine integration that Almaas has achieved, the way he has created a coherent framework that respects both psychological and spiritual dimensions. One area where their views on religion differ significantly is the question of God. Jung famously said, when asked if he believed in God, "I don't believe, I know." By this he meant that he had direct experience of what he called the God image within the psyche, the numinous reality of the self. But he remained agnostic about whether there is a God beyond the psyche. Psychology can study the human experience of God, but it cannot prove or disprove God's objective existence. This was a strategic position for Jung, allowing him to take religious experience seriously without making claims that would be rejected by scientific materialists. But it left some questions unresolved. If the self is the God image in the psyche, what is the relationship between this inner God image and the God that religious people claim to worship? Is God nothing but a psychological reality? Or is the psyche the place where we experience a transcendent God? Jung's own statements on this were complex and sometimes contradictory. At times, he seemed to suggest that the psyche is all we can know, that questions beyond the psyche are unanswerable. At other times, he hinted at a metaphysical reality beyond the psyche, a cosmic or transcendent dimension that the psyche reflects or participates in. His late work on synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences that seem to link inner and outer reality, pointed toward a reality that transcends the division between psyche and matter. Almaas is more explicit in affirming a spiritual or metaphysical dimension. In his later work, particularly in books like The Inner Journey Home and Runaway Realization, he speaks of the absolute, the ultimate nature of reality that transcends all manifestation. This absolute is not a personal God in the theistic sense, but neither is it simply a psychological state. It is described as the ground of all, existence, the source from which all qualities and all forms arise. Essence, in Almaas's understanding, is a manifestation of this absolute. It is the absolute taking form as particular qualities. Being is the absolute experienced personally as one's own nature. So there is a clear ontological hierarchy in Almaas's system: the absolute, being or true nature, essence and its qualities, and the world of manifestation, including both psyche and matter. This puts Almaas more in the camp of perennial philosophy or non-dual spirituality than Jung's more cautious psychological approach. Almaas is willing to make metaphysical claims, to speak of ultimate reality, to say that there is a dimension beyond the personal psyche. Yet he also insists that this is not a matter of belief or speculation, but of direct experience. The absolute can be realized, not through thought, but through a deepening of presence until all forms dissolve into the formless. How would Jung respond to this? One can imagine him being both appreciative and cautious, appreciative of the phenomenological precision, of the careful mapping of experiences, of the recognition that there are dimensions beyond the personal ego, cautious about the metaphysical claims, about speaking with certainty about the absolute, about the potential for inflation in claiming to know ultimate reality. Jung saw many of his patients who had spiritual experiences become inflated, identifying themselves with divine or cosmic realities in ways that were more grandiose than genuine. He would want to know, how do we distinguish genuine spiritual realization from psychological inflation? How do we avoid the trap of spiritual ego, the self who thinks it has transcended the self? Almaas is very aware of these dangers. The diamond approach includes careful attention to the various forms of spiritual ego, the ways that spiritual attainment can become a new identity, a new source of pride or specialness. True realization, Almaas, teaches, does not create a better or more special ego. It reveals the transparency of all ego structures, including spiritual ones. The recognition of true nature includes the recognition that there is no one there to claim the realization. This points to a deep convergence between Jung and Almaas, despite their different languages. Both recognize that the ultimate transformation involves a relativization of the ego, a recognition that the ego is not the center or the whole. For Jung, this comes through the realization of the self, the recognition that the ego is a servant or representative of a greater whole. For Almaas, it comes through the realization of true nature, the recognition that the personal self is a manifestation of being itself. Different words, but a similar movement. Let us turn now to their understandings of psychological development and the stages or phases of inner growth. Jung spoke of the two halves of life. The first half, roughly the first 40 years, is about ego development, about establishing oneself in the world, building a career, forming relationships, creating a social persona. This is necessary and important work. The ego needs to be strong and functional. But at midlife, something shifts. The values and goals that motivated the first half of life begin to feel hollow. Success, achievement, social recognition, these no longer satisfy in the way they once did. There is a sense of something missing, a hunger for meaning that worldly accomplishments cannot fill. This is the midlife crisis, which Jung saw not as pathology but as a natural developmental transition, the psyche's call to begin the second half of life. The second half of life is about individuation, about turning inward, about developing the relationship with the self. This often involves a withdrawal of energy from outer achievement and a turning toward inner reflection. Interests that were dormant in the first half of life emerge: spiritual questions, creative pursuits, the desire to understand one's own nature more deeply. The task is no longer to adapt to the world, but to become who one truly is. This is a generalization, of course, and Jung recognized that individuals vary widely. Some people begin individuation earlier, often prompted by illness, loss, or psychological crisis. Some people never begin it, remaining identified with ego and persona throughout life. But the pattern of the two halves of life provided a useful framework for understanding adult development. Almaas has a different but complementary model. He maps the development of the ego structures in childhood and then the process of their dissolution and transformation in the journey to essence. In his understanding, the infant is born in a state of relatively undifferentiated unity with essence, what might be called a primordial connection to true nature. But as the ego develops, as the child learns to distinguish self and other as psychological structures, this connection is gradually lost. The structures develop in layers, each layer forming as a response to particular challenges or losses. The first structures to form have to do with basic survival and safety. If these needs are not met, the child develops what Almaas calls the schizoid position, a fundamental distrust and withdrawal from connection. If the child's existence is supported, but their autonomy is not, they may develop symbiotic structures, an inability to be separate and self-directed. As development continues, the child forms structures around power, recognition, identity, intimacy. Each structure is a brilliant, creative solution to the problem of living in a world that does not fully see and support their essential nature. But each structure is also a cage, a limitation, a substitution of false for real. The spiritual journey, as Almaas maps it, involves a gradual dismantling of these structures, moving from the surface to the depths. We begin by recognizing the most obvious defensive patterns, the ways we try to control, please, or withdraw in our relationships. As these patterns are seen and understood, they begin to loosen, and we contact deeper layers. Eventually, we reach what Almaas calls the pits or the core of the egoic structure, the deepest and most defended wounds, the most unbearable feelings of deficiency. This is terrifying territory. It feels like annihilation, like the end of existence. Yet it is precisely here, in the core of the wound, that the deepest transformation happens. The willingness to experience what felt unendurable allows the structure to dissolve, and essence floods back in. Beyond this dissolution of the surface structures lies what Almaas calls the essential identity, the experience of oneself as essence rather than as an ego structure. This is a major transition, what in some spiritual traditions is called awakening or enlightenment. But Almaas emphasizes that this is not the end of the journey. There are further depths to explore, further dimensions of true nature to realize. In his later work, Almaas maps what he calls the formless dimensions, realizations of spaciousness, emptiness, the absolute, and then what he calls the boundless dimensions, where essence and emptiness are integrated, where one experiences oneself as both fullness and openness, both manifestation and mystery. This is sophisticated, detailed cartography of the inner terrain, providing a map for a journey that may take decades. Jung's model is less detailed in some ways, more archetypal and symbolic. He did not provide a stage-by-stage map in the way Almaas does, but his understanding of the individuation process has its own phases. There is the recognition of the persona and its limitations, the encounter with the shadow, the meeting with the anima or animus, and ultimately the constellation of the self. Each of these is a major threshold, a transformation of consciousness. Both models honor the reality that psychological and spiritual development is a long process, not a sudden event. Both recognize that there are layers, depths, stages, each with its own challenges and gifts. Both see that the journey requires patience, courage, and support. And both ultimately point toward a transformation of identity, a shift from ego-based to essence-based or self-based consciousness. Let us drift now into deeper waters, into the more philosophical and poetic dimensions of their dialogue. As sleep draws closer, as the boundaries of thought soften, we can allow ourselves to wonder about the larger patterns, the bigger questions that their work illuminates. Both Jung and Almaas are, at heart, explorers of consciousness. They are not content with the surface of awareness, with the ordinary waking consciousness that deals with practical tasks and social interactions. They want to know, what else is here? What depths lie beneath the surface? What possibilities of human consciousness have not yet been realized? This impulse to explore consciousness is ancient. It is the impulse of the mystic, the shaman, the philosopher, the artist. It is the same impulse that led the Buddha to sit under the Bodhi tree, that led Plotinus to contemplate the One, that led Teresa of Avila to explore her interior castle. It is the human spirit's refusal to accept that the visible, material world is all there is, the intuition that consciousness opens onto infinite depths. What Jung and Almaas both discovered in their different ways is that consciousness is not a simple thing. It is not a static awareness that merely observes a world of objects. Consciousness has structure, depth, dynamics. It has layers and dimensions. It contains within itself multiplicities, Jung's complexes and archetypes, Almaas's structures and essential aspects. And yet it is also, in its deepest nature, unified, whole, integrated. This paradox that consciousness is both multiple and unified runs through both of their works. Jung saw the psyche as a system of complexes, semi-autonomous entities that can function independently and even against each other. He saw the archetypes as distinct patterns with their own character and energy. Yet he also saw the self as the integration of all these parts, the wholeness that includes and transcends the multiplicity. Almaas similarly sees the personality as composed of structures, each with its own logic and history, and he sees essence as having multiple qualities or aspects, each distinct. Compassion is not the same as strength. Peace is not the same as joy. Yet he also speaks of the unity of being, the recognition that all these aspects are facets of one true nature, and beyond even the unity of being, the absolute that transcends all distinction. This paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. We are both multiple and unified. Our psyche contains multitudes, as Walt Whitman said, and yet we are also one self, one consciousness, one being. The journey of individuation or realization is not about choosing between multiplicity and unity, but about learning to hold both, to live in the tension and the dance between them. Another profound theme that emerges from their dialogue is the question of meaning. Jung saw the loss of meaning as the central pathology of modern life. In traditional cultures, he observed, people's lives were embedded in mythological and religious frameworks that gave existence, meaning, and purpose. You were part of a cosmic story. Your life had a role in a greater drama. But modern secular culture has largely lost these frameworks, leaving people adrift, without context or purpose. The symptoms that brought people to Jung's consulting room were often, at their root, symptoms of meaninglessness. The depression, the anxiety, the addictions, the compulsions, these were attempts to fill or to flee from the void of meaninglessness. And Jung's therapy was, in large part, a therapy of meaning-making. Through dream work, through active imagination, through the recognition of archetypal patterns, people reconnected with the deeper sources of meaning within the psyche. Almaas addresses the same issue but from a different angle. In his understanding, the loss of meaning is related to the loss of essence. When we are identified with ego structures, when we are living from the false solutions rather than from our true nature, life inevitably feels hollow. We may achieve success, we may accumulate possessions and experiences, but none of it truly satisfies because it is not addressing the real hunger, which is the hunger for being itself. The restoration of meaning, then, comes not through finding a better story or a more convincing belief system, but through reconnecting with essence. When you experience your own essential nature, when you touch the qualities of being directly, meaning is immediately present. It is not something you have to think about or construct. It is intrinsic to the experience of presence itself. This is a profound convergence. Both Jung and Almaas see that meaning cannot be manufactured by the ego, cannot be imposed through belief or effort. Rather, meaning arises naturally from connection to the deeper sources for Jung, the self and the archetypes, for Almaas, essence and true nature. When we are connected to these depths, meaning is self-evident. When we are cut off from them, no amount of external achievement or distraction can fill the void. This points to a common diagnosis of the modern condition. We are a civilization that has developed incredible external power, technological, economic, political, but has lost connection to the inner sources. We can manipulate the material world with unprecedented precision, but we do not know who we are or why we exist. We are, in Almaas's terms, caught in the structures, brilliant and complex structures that can build civilizations and fly to the moon, but that have lost contact with essence. Both Jung and Almaas offer paths back to the source, back to the depths, back to the center. Jung's path is through the symbolic imagination, through tending the dreams and images that arise from the unconscious, through establishing a living relationship with the inner figures and forces. Almaas's path is through direct inquiry into present experience, through the patient dissolution of structures and the recognition of essence. These paths are not mutually exclusive. One can imagine someone working with both, attending to dreams and symbols, while also practicing presence and inquiry. Indeed, many contemporary practitioners integrate Jungian and experiential or somatic approaches in exactly this way. The dialogue between Jung and Almaas is not a debate about who is right, but an offering of complementary tools for the same fundamental task, awakening to our deeper nature. There is also a fascinating convergence in their views on love. For Jung, love was a central mystery, one of the great powers of the psyche. In his psychological typology, he distinguished between thinking and feeling as two of the four functions of consciousness, and he saw that many people, particularly in modern Western culture, had overdeveloped thinking at the expense of feeling. The recovery of feeling, of the capacity for relatedness and love, was crucial for wholeness. Jung also wrote about love in relation to the anima and animus, the contrasexual archetypes. He saw that we project our anima or animus onto others, falling in love with the carrier of our projection. This projection is not just illusion, it is the psyche's way of trying to connect with the inner other, with the contrasexual aspect of ourselves. The work is to gradually withdraw the projection, recognizing and integrating the anima, or animus, within, while also developing the capacity for real relationship with another person as they actually are, not as a projection screen. Almaas explores love as one of the essential qualities. Essential love is not an emotion or a feeling in the ordinary sense. It is a quality of being, a state of consciousness that is loving by its very nature. When essential love is present, there is a warmth, an openness, a melting quality. There is a natural caring for whatever is present, a tenderness that does not depend on the object being pleasant or attractive. Essential love can be experienced in relation to another person, but it can also be experienced alone, as a quality of one's own being. In fact, Almaas suggests that we can only truly love another when we are connected to essential love within ourselves. Without that connection, what we call love is often need, desire for completion, projection of our own essential absence onto the other. This is similar to Jung's understanding, but articulated more explicitly in experiential terms. Both are saying that love is not primarily about the other person, but about a quality or capacity within ourselves. The other may evoke or trigger this quality, but the source is within. And the developmental journey involves discovering love as an intrinsic capacity rather than something that depends on external circumstances. There is a beautiful parallel here to mystical understandings of love across traditions. In Sufism, love is the central path, the way the soul returns to God. In Christianity, God is love, and the commandment is to love God and neighbor. In Buddhism, metta, or loving kindness, is one of the primary practices. All of these traditions point to love as not merely an emotion, but as a fundamental reality, a quality of the divine or of ultimate reality itself. Jung and Almaas, coming from psychological starting points, arrive at similar insights. Love is not just a nice feeling or a moral duty. It is a quality of consciousness, an aspect of the self or of essence, a dimension of our fundamental nature. To realize love is to realize an aspect of what we most deeply are. As the night deepens, as the mind's grip loosens further, we can allow ourselves to wonder about the relationship between the psychological and the spiritual, the question that haunts both Jung's and Almaas's work. Are these two different domains, or are they one? Is spirituality just a subset of psychology, as Freud suggested, the psyche projecting its own contents onto a cosmic screen? Or is psychology merely the surface of something deeper, the gateway to spiritual realities that transcend the personal psyche? Jung tried to walk a middle path. He insisted on studying religious phenomena psychologically, treating them as facts of the psyche to be investigated empirically. But he also refused to reduce religion to psychology, maintaining that the numinous experiences people have are real experiences, not just projections or illusions. The God image in the psyche is real as a psychic reality, and that reality is meaningful and powerful regardless of whether there is a God beyond the psyche. This position satisfied neither the religious believers, who felt Jung was reducing God to a psychological category, nor the scientific materialists, who felt Jung was sneaking metaphysics in through the back door. But Jung was committed to staying with the tension, not collapsing one side into the other. Almaas resolves the tension differently. For him, the psychological and the spiritual are two dimensions of one reality. The psychological dimension is the dimension of structure, of patterns formed by history and conditioning. The spiritual dimension is the dimension of essence, of being itself. They are not separate realms, but different layers or aspects of human consciousness. The psychological work is necessary preparation for spiritual realization. We cannot simply jump to essence while bypassing the structures, because the structures will continue to distort and limit our experience. But the psychological work is not sufficient by itself. It can help us function better, understand ourselves more clearly, but it cannot by itself reveal our essential nature. For that, we need the shift from structure to essence, from doing to being, from content to presence. In this framework, psychology and spirituality are complementary rather than contradictory. Good psychology makes space for spiritual realization by clearing away the obstacles, by understanding and dissolving the structures. Genuine spirituality includes psychological awareness, recognizing the ways that ego patterns can co-opt spiritual experience and teachings. This integration of psychological and spiritual is one of Almaas's major contributions. He is not simply importing spiritual teachings into a psychological framework or vice versa. He is showing how psychological understanding and spiritual realization can support and inform each other, how they are two aspects of one transformative process. Jung might have appreciated this integration while still maintaining his more agnostic stance about ultimate realities. His gift was to make space for religious and spiritual experience within a scientific age, to show that these experiences are real and meaningful even if we cannot prove metaphysical claims. Almaas's gift is to provide detailed phenomenological maps of spiritual realization, showing how essence can be directly experienced and how that experience relates to psychological structures. Together, they offer a rich dialogue about the nature of human transformation. Jung's symbolic, archetypal approach provides depth, context, and connection to the collective human wisdom encoded in myths and religions. Almaas's experiential, essential approach provides precision, immediacy, and practical methods for realizing one's true nature. A person engaged in deep inner work might benefit from both, using Jung's tools to understand the symbolic dimensions and Almaas's tools to contact the essential dimensions. Let us explore one more area of their process, dialogue, before we drift into the final reflections. This is the question of autonomy and guidance, of individual path and universal principles. Jung was deeply committed to the principle of individuation, which implies that each person's path is unique. The archetypes are universal, but the way they manifest in each individual life is specific to that person's unique context, history, and purpose. Jung was therefore cautious about prescriptive teachings, about spiritual systems that claim to have the one true path for everyone. He saw that what works for one person may not work for another, that spiritual practices need to be adapted to individual temperament and situation. He encouraged his patients to find their own way, guided by their dreams and the wisdom of their own unconscious, rather than simply following external authorities. This emphasis on individual path was both a gift and a challenge. The gift is the honoring of each person's uniqueness, the recognition that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the mysteries of existence. The challenge is the potential for confusion and aimlessness, for not having clear guidance or markers on the path. Almaas's approach includes both universal principles and individual uniqueness. The diamond approach maps a terrain that is, in some sense, universal. The structures of ego, the qualities of essence, the dimensions of realization, these are presented as common features of human consciousness that anyone can discover. There is a kind of curriculum, a progression through different territories that students typically move through. Yet Almaas also emphasizes that each person's journey is unique. The order in which essential aspects appear, the specific challenges and openings, the particular pattern of one's structures, all these are individual. The teacher's role is not to impose a fixed path, but to recognize where the student is and what is emerging in their process, helping them to see and understand their own experience more clearly. This balance between universal principles and individual path is perhaps one of the most delicate aspects of any spiritual or psychological teaching. Too much emphasis on universal principles, and the teaching becomes rigid, forcing people into boxes that do not fit. Too much emphasis on individual path, and the teaching loses coherence, becoming so relativistic that it cannot offer real guidance. Both Jung and Almaas navigate this balance, though with different emphases. Jung leans more toward individual uniqueness, trusting the wisdom of each person's unconscious to guide their development. Almaas leans more toward universal principles, mapping common structures and stages while still honoring individual variation. Again, these are complementary rather than contradictory approaches. There is also the question of practice versus spontaneity. Some spiritual traditions emphasize regular, disciplined practice, meditation, prayer, rituals. Other traditions emphasize spontaneity, following the natural flow, not imposing methods or techniques. Jung tended toward the latter. He did not prescribe meditation or other spiritual practices, though he did not discourage them either. His method was to attend to what emerged naturally, dreams, fantasies, symptoms, and to work with those. Almaas's diamond approach includes both practice and spontaneity. There is the practice of inquiry, the regular engagement with groups and teachers, the commitment to showing up and working with whatever arises. But within that container, there is tremendous openness to the spontaneous unfolding of each person's process. Inquiry is not a technique to be rigidly applied, but a living exploration that follows the organic movement of experience. This combination seems to honor both the need for some structure and discipline and the need for openness to the unexpected, the emergent, the spontaneous. It is another example of holding the tension between opposites rather than collapsing into one pole. As we move toward the conclusion of our journey through this dialogue, let us allow the themes to weave together to create a tapestry rather than a linear argument. The conversation between Jung and Almaas is not a simple story with a beginning, middle, and end. It is more like a musical composition with multiple themes that appear, develop, interweave, and resolve into a complex harmony. There is the theme of the depths, the recognition that human consciousness has layers, dimensions, territories that are not visible in ordinary awareness. Both Jung and Almaas are cartographers of these depths, providing maps that help us navigate the inner terrain. Their maps differ in many details, but they are mapping overlapping territories, and a traveler can benefit from having both maps available. There is the theme of wholeness, the vision that human beings are meant to be integrated, complete, fully realized. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, undivided and whole. Almaas calls it realization, the recognition and embodiment of your true nature. Different words, but a shared vision of human potential. There is the theme of transformation, the recognition that profound change is possible, that we are not doomed to repeat the same patterns forever, that consciousness can shift, evolve, deepen. Both offer methods for facilitating this transformation, and both trust in a process that is larger than the ego's will, an intelligence that guides development from within. There is the theme of meaning, the understanding that human beings need more than material comfort or social success, that we hunger for purpose, significance, connection to something greater than ourselves. Both Jung and Almaas show that this meaning is not found outside but inside, not in beliefs or ideologies, but in the direct experience of the psyche's depths or of essential being. There is the theme of integration, of bringing together opposites, of including rather than excluding. Jung spoke of the union of opposites as the goal of alchemy and of psychological development. Almaas speaks of the boundless dimensions where essence and emptiness, fullness and openness are discovered to be one. Both point toward a consciousness that can hold complexity and paradox without collapsing into simplistic either-or thinking. And there is the theme of love, running quietly through both of their works. Not sentimental love or romantic love, though these have their place, but love as a fundamental quality of consciousness, a way of being that is open, receptive, caring. Both suggest that the journey of transformation is, in some essential way, a journey into love, into the recognition that love is not something we must earn or achieve, but something we already are when the barriers are removed. These themes do not resolve into neat conclusions. They remain alive, generative, open-ended. This is as it should be. Jung and Almaas are not offering final answers, but opening questions, not solving the mystery, but inviting us into deeper relationship with it. The dialogue between them is not a debate to be won, but a conversation to be continued, a living exploration that each of us can join. If you were to work with both perspectives, what might that look like? You might keep a dream journal, as Jung recommended, attending to the images and stories that arise in sleep, exploring them through association and amplification. You might also practice inquiry, as Almaas teaches, sitting quietly and bringing awareness to your immediate experience, following the thread of sensation and feeling into deeper dimensions. You might notice when dreams present archetypal images, the wise old man, the terrible mother, the shadow figure, and explore these through active imagination, engaging with them as living presences. You might also notice when you are caught in an ego structure, contracted and defended, and inquire into the direct experience of that contraction, allowing it to reveal the whole beneath it and the essence that can flow through. You might read mythology, fairy tales, and religious texts, as Jung did, allowing these stories to illuminate your own journey, seeing your struggles reflected in the universal patterns. You might also study the precise phenomenology of essential aspects and ego structures that Almaas has mapped, using these as references for understanding your own inner terrain. You might work with a Jungian analyst, bringing dreams and exploring the symbolic dimension of your experience. You might also work with a diamond approach teacher, practicing inquiry and discovering essence. Or you might work with a therapist or guide who integrates multiple approaches, drawing on Jung's insights into the symbolic psyche and Almaas's insights into essential realization. The point is not to choose between them, but to receive what each offers. Jung gives us a profound respect for the symbolic imagination, for the wisdom of the unconscious, for the archetypal patterns that connect us to the collective human journey. He gives us tools for engaging with this symbolic dimension, for reading the psyche's language, for honoring the mystery without trying to dissolve it prematurely. Almaas gives us precision about inner experience, a phenomenological clarity that helps us distinguish genuine essence from ego imitation. He gives us the practice of inquiry, a way of exploring experience that is both rigorous and open. He gives us a map of the structures that block essence and a clear understanding of the qualities of essence that we can discover. Together, they offer a remarkably complete approach to human consciousness and its transformation. Jung provides the depth, the connection to history and myth, the symbolic richness. Almaas provides the precision, the experiential immediacy, the practical method. A person who worked with both perspectives would have access to a powerful set of tools for inner exploration. But beyond the tools and techniques, beyond the theories and maps, what Jung and Almaas both point to is something very simple and very profound: the invitation to know yourself. Not to know about yourself, not to accumulate psychological information or spiritual concepts, but to actually experience your own consciousness directly, to discover who and what you are beneath the surface identifications. This is the ancient call of the oracle at Delphi: know thyself. It is the Buddha's invitation to come and see. It is the Sufi's quest to know the beloved. It is the alchemist's search for the gold that is already present in the lead. It is the eternal human question, who am I? Jung approached this question through the symbolic imagination, through the dialogue with the figures and forces of the unconscious, through the gradual realization of the self as the organizing center beyond the ego. Almaas approached it through direct inquiry into present experience, through the dissolution of structures and the recognition of essence, through the realization of true nature. Both paths lead to a similar destination, a shift in identity, a recognition that what you thought you were is not the whole story, that there are depths and dimensions of your being that you had not suspected. The ego that you took yourself to be is real but partial, a necessary function but not the center. The center is deeper, vaster, more mysterious. And yet, this deeper center is not foreign or distant. It is intimate, closer than your breath. It is what you have always been, though you did not recognize it. The journey is not so much a matter of going somewhere else or becoming something new, as it is a matter of recognizing what has always been here, removing the veils, clearing the obstructions, allowing what is to reveal itself. In Jung's language, this is the paradox of the self. It is both the totality you are becoming and the center you have always had. The self is both goal and ground, both the destination of individuation and the source from which the journey began. In Almaas's language, this is the paradox of essence. It is what you have lost and what you have never not been. The absence that drives your search and the presence that ends it. These paradoxes cannot be resolved intellectually. They can only be lived, experienced, realized. And the realization does not happen all at once, in a single moment of enlightenment, but unfolds gradually, over years and decades, as a deepening recognition, a growing capacity to rest in what you are. Both Jung and Almaas emphasize that this is not a comfortable process. The dissolution of ego structures, the encounter with the shadow, the facing of the holes, all of this is difficult, often painful. There is grief for what must be let go, fear of the unknown, resistance from the parts of us that have invested everything in the old. Identity. The journey requires courage, patience, and support, but both also testify that it is worth it. The life that emerges from genuine psychological and spiritual development is richer, fuller, more authentic than the life lived from ego alone. There is more freedom, more joy, more capacity for love and creativity. There is a sense of being aligned with something deeper, of living from your true center rather than from borrowed values and defensive strategies. And there is meaning. The deep satisfaction of knowing that your life is not random or meaningless, but is part of a larger pattern, a cosmic story, a sacred unfolding. Whether you understand this in Jung's terms, as participating in the archetypal drama of the collective unconscious and the realization of the self, or in Almaas's terms, as the manifestation of being exploring and realizing itself, the result is the same. Your existence matters, not because of what you achieve or accomplish, but because of what you are. As we come to the end of this long exploration, as sleep draws very near now, let us rest in the silence between the words, in the space where Jung and Almaas meet beyond their different languages. Both have given us gifts, maps, and methods for the inward journey. Both have pointed toward the same essential mystery, that we are more than we think we are, that consciousness opens onto infinite depths, that the journey of knowing ourselves is also the journey of coming home to what we have always been. You can let go now of trying to understand or remember everything that has been said. Let the words dissolve into the silence from which they came. Let the concepts and comparisons fade into the dark. What remains is the simple invitation to explore your own consciousness, to wonder about your own depths, to undertake your own journey of discovery. Perhaps you will work with dreams, as Jung taught, paying attention to the images and stories that arise from your unconscious, exploring them with curiosity and respect. Perhaps you will practice inquiry, as Almaas teaches, bringing awareness to your immediate experience, following the thread deeper into presence and essence. Perhaps you will find your own way, your own path through the territory they have mapped. But however you proceed, know that you are not alone. Countless seekers have walked these paths before you, have faced the same fears and discoveries, have undergone the same transformations. Jung and Almaas are two among many guides, and their wisdom is available to you, not as dogma to be believed, but as companionship on the journey, as lanterns illuminating the way. The journey is long, but it is also immediate. It takes a lifetime, and it happens in a moment. It requires effort and discipline, and it is also a matter of simply seeing what has always been here. These paradoxes are not problems to solve, but the nature of the terrain. The path to the self or to essence is not a straight line, but a spiral, circling deeper with each turn, returning to the same places but at different levels. And the journey is not separate from life. It does not require withdrawing from the world or rejecting ordinary experience. Rather, it is about bringing consciousness to life, about living your actual life with greater awareness, presence, and authenticity. The dreams you attend to are your dreams. The structures you dissolve are your structures. The essence you discover is your essence. It is all deeply personal, even as it opens onto the universal. Jung would tell you to trust your own psyche, to listen to your dreams, to engage with the figures and symbols that arise, to follow the thread of your own individuation wherever it leads. He would remind you that no one else can live your life or make your journey for you, that you must find your own way, guided by the wisdom of your own depths. Almaas would tell you to be curious about your experience, to inquire into what is actually happening in this moment, to notice the structures and the essence, to be patient with the process. He would remind you that realization is not something you achieve by effort, but something you allow by relaxing the effort, by letting go of the need to be anywhere other than here. Both would tell you that the journey is worthwhile, that the depths are real, that the transformation is possible. Both would encourage you to be courageous in facing your shadow and your holes, to be patient with the slowness of real change, to be kind to yourself in the difficulty. And both would assure you that you are already whole, already complete, even as you grow and transform. As you drift now into sleep, let these ideas settle into your unconscious. Let them work in the depths while your conscious mind rests. Let Jung and Almaas continue their conversation in your dreams, weaving together their different perspectives into something new, something uniquely yours. Let their wisdom become seeds planted in the soil of your psyche, seeds that will sprout and grow in their own time. And know that when you wake, the journey continues. Each day is another opportunity to attend to your dreams, to inquire into your experience, to discover more of who and what you are. Each challenge is an invitation to understand yourself more deeply. Each moment of presence is a touching of essence. Each symbol that captures your imagination is a message from the self. The dialogue between Jung and Almaas is not just about two historical figures and their ideas. It is about the dialogue within consciousness itself, the ongoing conversation between the symbolic and the immediate, the imaginal and the experiential, the psychological and the spiritual. This dialogue is happening within you, within all of us, whether we know it or not. By studying Jung and Almaas, by exploring their different approaches, we become more conscious participants in this dialogue, more able to work skillfully with all the dimensions of our experience. So as the night envelops you completely now, as consciousness dissolves into the dream world, rest in the knowledge that you are held by something larger. Whether you call it the self or true nature, whether you experience it through symbols or through direct presence, it is there, the ground and goal of your existence, waiting to be recognized, calling you home. Thank you for traveling with me through this long night's journey into Jung and Almaas, into the territories where psychology and spirituality meet, where the personal and universal intersect, where the mind explores its own depths. May their wisdom guide you. May your dreams be luminous. May your inquiry be fruitful. And may you discover, in your own time and way, the wholeness that you are. Sleep well, wanderer. The journey continues tomorrow.